תודה רבה, רננה. הנה מה טוב ומנייס, שבת אחים גם יחד. That may be all that I know, all that I speak in Hebrew today. But being here, I feel like I truly learned more about the meaning of those words. Being here with Yozma, Derek Halev, Open Dialogue, Soteria, ISPS has been amazing. I have learned some other Hebrew words, Yalla, Zababa, and someone taught me, I love this, if your car gets smashed, you can say, Kapurot avonot, and it turns it into a good thing. That's a good thing. So this has been an amazing experience for me. So the first place that I went when I arrived in Israel was actually the port in Jaffa, this ancient port city, because for me, I do know from Yom Kippur the story of Yonah, or Jonah, as we say it in the United States. To me, Yonah is a very important ancestor because his story teaches me not to run away from my experiences. And I'm someone that for many years ran away from voices, from difficulty. Actually, I was encouraged to do that. I was told to ignore my experience, not to talk about it, to numb it, to flee from it. But like Yonah, this landed me in a pretty dark place. A pretty dark place. So now, with others, I explore some of these third options when we let go of fear and we consider exploring what are we experiencing? What is the story? What might it mean? So I'm sure for a lot of us here, we've had these moments where it felt like an impossible choice. What do I do? Do I ignore this voice that I'm hearing? Do I take so many drugs to make the voice go away that I can barely move my body? Do I share about this voice that I'm hearing? Or do I risk the ridicule that comes in our society for voice hearers? And then I think this question might apply to a lot of us here. This impossible choice question. What do I do? Do I work in a system where I know I'm not treating people as human, not listening to their story? Do I work in a system that might delegitimize people? Or do I quit and do nothing at all? So HBN, what we've been working on here, presents that radical third option, that Yam Sooth moment where between slavery and drowning, we find a radical third option. So what this talk is going to be about is options, choices, and being in community instead of being in fear. And I'm not going to be running away from my experience. I'm going to share very openly with you today what it's like for me and for others that I support. What is it like to hear things, see things, feel things that other people don't? So first, I just want to give some context to my life. So I grew up in an environment in the Midwest of the United States. Jews are very assimilated there. It's not something you talk about. Where I'm from, there's a lot of things, actually, that you don't talk about. You're only supposed to talk about pleasant things. Things like the weather or what's on sale at Walmart. Have people heard of Walmart? You can talk about Walmart. You can talk about who won which basketball game or what football game. But you don't talk about deep emotions. Where I'm from, it's not part of the culture. You also don't challenge authority where I'm from. That's strongly discouraged in Midwestern United States. And all of this was a really tough thing for me because people in authority roles hurt me. And I had some really painful experiences that it would have been good to be able to talk about. So my parents were lawyers, both of them. This is common amongst Jewish people in America, a very common profession for them to have. And they worked a lot. Americans work a lot. And I was often left in the care of other people. And now that I'm 40 years old, I understand that a lot of the things I experienced when I was young, that they were abuse, that they were physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. But at that time, they were being framed as punishment. And I thought, I should never tell anyone that this is happening because I might get punished again. I might get punished again because I had disrespected my elders. And so I couldn't figure out, how do I keep myself from getting hurt? How do I stop other children, like my siblings, from getting hurt? I didn't know, and it was very confusing. So it was this confusing world when my voices first arrived. So the first time that I remember hearing a voice, I was 5 years old. And I was standing next to my Big Bird big wheel. I know you have Sesame Street here. I've learned that Moishe Ufnik is a big part of that. Big Bird was my favorite character. And I had a Big Bird bright yellow bike. I was standing next to it and I was watching a woman who had hurt me. She had hit me. She had put floor cleaning chemicals on my hand and scrubbed it with a brush until my hand had burned. So I was watching her very, very closely. And she turned to a friend of hers and she said, in a very American way, You know, Lorraine, there ain't a cloud in the sky today. There's not a cloud in the sky. And I remember hearing very clearly the voice of a man just over my right shoulder. There was no man there, but I heard a man, and he said to me, "They're liars. They're liars. There are clouds in the sky. They are liars, and I hate them." Now, I was 5, so for me, I hadn't learned yet to be afraid of the voice. But this voice was very interesting and compelling to me because the voice used the word hate. And I was not allowed to hate things. When I had said, "I'd hate this," or "I'd hate that," I had been hit. So this voice for me felt a lot like an ally, a protector in some ways. At least he was sort of a friend. Now, over time, he would come to hold most of my pain. So something that's really common for people like me is we start hearing a voice after a tough time, like abuse, living in a stressful environment. A voice comes as a warning. And if we listen to that voice by changing the environment, a lot of times that voice goes away, or the voice remains quite neutral, not scary, a voice that is just like another member of your family who lives in your head. So it can be this way. Unfortunately, in my life, the problems did not stop. So the voice came as a warning, but the problems got bigger and bigger and bigger. They didn't change. And so what happened? My voice that I would play games with and was a lot like a friend, he became more and more frightened. And so when I was 8 years old, my country entered a war, and I would see these bombs exploding, and I understood that people were dying. This other image here is of a war memorial in my country. My mom took me there when I was a child, and she wrote in her journal about how I completely freaked out. My voice was screaming. So there was something about war and violence that also made this voice much more extreme. And again, this is really, really common. I'm not unique in this. In the United States, in more violent cultures, people tend to hear more violent voices. For some of us, the voices are how we try to make sense of pain and violence in our outside environment. So over time, this voice became more threatening. So when I was 8, that was when things got bad enough in my life that teachers started to notice. Another important thing in American Jewish families is doing really well in school so that you can be a lawyer or a doctor. And I wasn't doing well in school. And so a teacher talked to me, and I said, I'm scared. He's telling me that bad things are going to happen. I can't sleep at night. People are going to be hurt. And so the teacher said to me, talk to my parents. They got on the phone. And then they said, oh, it's okay. We're going to get you some help. We'll get you some help, Caroline. And I thought that was great. I needed help. I thought someone was going to help me stop the war. I thought someone was going to help me keep kids from getting hurt. Unfortunately, that is not what help ended up being. Help meant taking me to see a doctor. And even though I was 8 years old, I still knew why people go to see a doctor. Why do people go to see a doctor? Because you're sick. Because there's something wrong in you. Not that the war needs to stop, but the problem is in you. And that was the first time I got this message. I am the problem, and to fix my problem, I have to go to an expert. And what this expert will do is provide me with pills. And the pills came with many names: anti-psychotic, anti-anxiety, antidepressant. And I would love to say that for me, they took the fear away from me or my voices, that they changed things for me. But they didn't. I can't honestly say this. What they did was slow everything down for me. My thinking, my metabolism, my body became much bigger. My hands would shake. And the voices sounded like they were underwater, which in some ways was scarier because I couldn't hear what he was saying. And as you can see on this slide, I need to hear what this voice is saying to stay in a good relationship with him. I have to tell this voice every day what we're going to do so he doesn't become afraid. I have to remember that this voice has values of protection, and he wants to feel a part of a team. So what helps me is to remember when the voice is screaming, he might just feel afraid, and I need to take a pause, slow my breathing, and communicate. I need to take a beat, as we say, and think about, how do I draw this voice back into the team? Now, I want to talk about some of the other voices that I hear, because even though I was seeing all these different doctors, I actually started to hear more types of voices. So the doctors never really asked me who the voices sounded like. They didn't want to discuss the content of the voice. And that was a big problem, because if they had, they would know that one of my scariest voices sounded exactly like the woman in that first story who had hurt me. She said the exact same things, but it took me years to be able to figure that out. I consider this voice to be an echo of shame. For a lot of us, if we want to make any difference in the voices that we hear, we have to develop a strong identity. We have to address the shame of our trauma. We need to change our wider cultures to make voice hearers less marginalized. We put really strong labels on people who hear voices. I've heard many difficult things about myself: psychotic, crazy, manipulative, I can't even say it. A lot of these different words. And if we don't begin to address shame and trauma, these voices cannot be addressed. So for me, this voice, she is someone that I have to stand up to and say, you know, when she's saying to me, "Who do you think you are, Missy? Who do you think you are?" I'll say, "I'm Caroline Mazzel-Carlton. That's who I think I am. And I have people that I need to go out and talk to today. People I need to show love and compassion to today. That's who I am. And that's what we're going to do." But again, the system that I was in, the mental health system, wasn't really helping me to do this. So just an example. Let's see. So when I was a teenager, there was a band, a music group called Nirvana. Very important to me as a teenager, because Nirvana said we can talk about emotional pain. If we're suffering, we can sing that out loud. We can admit that we're in pain. We don't have to be brave all the time or pretend that we're cool all the time. We can wear dirty cardigans and talk about our sadness. Now, one day when I was a teenager, the lead singer of Nirvana died by suicide. He ended his life, and it was very difficult for me. And so, as in many difficult times, I began to see things that others didn't see. I would walk around the school and I saw certain teenagers my age. It looked like they were bleeding, heavy blood. It looked to me like some people were bleeding from their heads. And so I was concerned, and I went to the therapist, very renowned therapist, and I said, "What does it mean? What does this mean that I'm seeing this?" And she said to me, "Caroline, what it means is you have a neurodegenerative disease. You have a neurodegenerative disease. And if you do not take these drugs, I know you don't like them, but if you don't take these drugs, your brain is going to further degrade. This can't be happening. You need to take those drugs." So again, this was very scary to hear. And it was also a lesson. Keep pushing your experience away, Caroline. You can't talk about it. Well, now I understand that these visions did have a meaning. Once again, right now, my life's work most frequently involves helping people who want to die, who are suicidal. And I think those visions were a call to me for what I was going to do, that this was important, to notice that pain and to do something about it. But instead, I was told, no, your brain is just degrading. I now understand, now that I'm 40 years old, not 15 years old, that what she said was scientifically inaccurate. There's no evidence that I had a neurodegenerative disease, and there's no evidence that taking dopamine blocking drugs will stop neurodegeneration. Actually, we must be careful with these substances because it can really be the opposite. But I was not given that information. After a lot of time in the system, encountering some very stressful doctors, but also police officers, I began to hear some new voices. All of this is happening in my teenage years. So I started to hear these voices that sounded like they were always talking about me. It sounded like they were behind me, a little behind and above me, always saying what I was doing to each other. Look, she's walking down the hall. She might not make it to class. Oh no, now she's going to try to leave the house. What's going to happen now? They would talk amongst each other, if that makes sense. This was really stressful. For me personally, I did not like people that don't talk directly to me. So this bothered me a lot. And I want to say too, because I was different than my classmates, because my hands shook, my body was large, my sometimes spit would come out of my mouth, I was bullied by my classmates too. So what have I come to learn about voices like this? So voices like this are a lesson for me that when we're doing this work, we need to really expand how we understand what trauma is. Okay? Trauma is not just war trauma. I have never actually been a soldier, though I have family members that are. Our country is different in this way, but I know a lot of you have to deal with military experiences. But bullying is also a trauma. Bullying can be correlated with hearing voices. So is the trauma in institutions or encountering police. So there were times when I was locked in a room, very aggressively, sent into a room with padding on the walls, mattresses on the walls, and sometimes the police, they beat me. And I remember like pounding on the door of a cell, like begging to be let out for many hours until my hand was black with bruise from the pounding. These types of experiences can often be reflected in voices later. So we need to be really careful about the power differentials in these treatment settings. So I think one of the biggest lessons that we learned this week in the HBN training was, how do we make the balance of power more equal? How do we create a space where everyone is an expert, it's not great to say to someone who's hearing voices, you lack insight. How could someone else have more insight into my voices? They can't even hear that. You can't even hear my voices. So how would you know more? So we're creating these communities where there's not a hierarchy, where there's not so much power in certain forms of knowledge, where we share the power. And the more that I did this, the more things changed with these voices. So I remember one time after I was working in the hospital, I now work as a mental health professional, and I have for 15 years, 15 years. After a time in the hospital, these voices came back because this was working in a hospital can be hard because it reminds me of tough times in my own life. And these voices came back and they're like, she's going to kill herself. She's going to kill herself. The other one said, yes, I think it's inevitable now. She's going to kill herself. I think it's going to happen. I just turned to the voices and I said, you know what, guys? You know what, Hebra? If I was going to have killed myself, don't you think I would have done it by now? You sound pretty fucking ridiculous. Sorry, but I have to swear at my voices sometimes. You sound pretty fucking ridiculous. If you think this is going to be the thing that tips me over the edge, I mean, come on. Seriously? And this is a strategy that a lot of voice hearers use. And interestingly enough, the voices actually talked to me. One of them said, well, we're just really scared, okay? And that was a big breakthrough for them. But again, it took me a lot of healing of institutional trauma and challenging those voices. So I'm going to pause here and talk a little bit more about this because sometimes this can be new information to people, like responding to voices. What I'll say though, for those of you who are learning open dialogue or other or internal family systems, other forms of therapy, remember, you can also ask these questions of voices too. And that can be really helpful when someone else asks your voice a question and talks to them. So any good, respectful, therapeutic, or dialogue technique, you can use that with the voice itself. You would just have the voice here report to you what the voice is saying, or sometimes just let the voice speak through their mouth, and you can respond and ask questions. But this is something that we teach at Wildflower Alliance. It's to help remind us that we always have choices. We always have choices in how to respond. So some of my voices, that strong communication works best, but other voices don't respond to that. So you need to take a more nurturing tone. So I hear voices of young children as well. It doesn't help to yell at them. That's just not gonna be useful. So you need to take like, I'm here, I love you, people are gonna protect you, you're safe. That sort of thing will work better. You can always use a humorous, kind of silly response like I used with the know-it-alls. And we always have the choice to just say silent. just listen to the voice or ignore it. So it's good to feel like you have choices. Again, I work with a lot of people who want to die, who are suicidal. And in that case, usually, suicide is not people's problem. Suicide is their solution. They're trying to solve a problem. So suicide is not just about feeling pain, but it's about feeling out of options to deal with that pain. So this approach that we use at Wildflower Alliance is about having lots of options. And so for some people, there is this fifth option as well, which is spiritual responses to the voices. So this initially did not work well for me, but you'll find out later that it does work now for some interesting reasons. I do want to kind of touch on one of the scariest voices that I hear and just remind people that I'm saying voices, but voice can be much bigger than just the sound of a voice. It can also include visions. It can include sensation. So when I started to hear this voice, it was after I was raped. I was sexually assaulted. And when I tried to report it, people didn't believe me because I had all these psychiatric labels. I wasn't someone people would trust. So not long after that happened, I began to hear this man. He would whisper this to me. He would say, "I'm going to cut your fingers off one by one." And he would say one by one over and over. And this also included a sensation in my body of severe pain in my hands. So it felt like I could feel this. He's scary to talk about, but this is a critical lesson that I think we all have to have in mind, which is sexual violence and sexual abuse. About 80 to 90% of people like me have had that experience, often under the age of 18. And just a reminder as well, because this is so common, maybe some of you are well versed in trauma healing modalities. Any great trauma healing modality will probably, be helpful for many voice hearers. So I use trauma healing modalities all the time, like neurofeedback. That's a big one that has helped me. I don't have time to explain what it is, but hopefully maybe that can be another workshop. Breath, working with the breath. There are ways to hack, as we say, the nervous system. We can hack into our parasympathetic nervous system just by breathing out longer than we breathe in. So this is a voice that I have trouble responding to because he's so scary, but that doesn't mean that I'm out of options. I actually have a number of healing options related to trauma. And of course, it's really important to talk about trauma, right? And to be believed. That's an important piece of this. And this voice, just because I haven't had success myself in talking to this voice, that doesn't mean that other people haven't. So my husband, Yitzchak, in the front, he can speak to this voice. He can say, like, in a deep voice, in this house, we respect women. And things like that are helpful in this scenario. Luckily, this is a voice that I hear very rarely now. I don't hear this voice often because, I think I've done a lot of healing work around it. And what will happen is if something really scary happens in the environment, a voice like this can come back. That's happened to me. But I just remember, there's something else here that I need to heal from. I don't need to freak out about this. And what I'll offer is some voices are really complicated because they sound like people that we once knew. So I also hear the voices of people who have died. That is actually the most common experience of hearing voices. And there was a time when my friend who had died, I had not had proper ways to grieve her. I was not allowed to go to her funeral, even though I wasn't allowed to go because I was in a facility that I couldn't leave. And she died of a drug overdose, of a drug that I also used. And I felt a lot of guilt and pain. And so around the anniversary of her death, I started to hear her saying, I miss you, I want to be with you, end your life, we need to be together. And so first, I kind of responded to her. It was very disturbing at first, but then I said to her in desperation, you know what, you're right, I will kill myself. Oh wait, sorry. This is that voice I'm talking about. It's hard. I can only see Hebrew. My Hebrew is bad. So what I said to this voice was, you're right. I will kill myself. But first, I have to read every word of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Every word. And that got me some space. The voice felt heard. And this is very common. It's called this is a bit vulgar, a half-assed attempt, a half-assed complying with the voice, only going halfway, but saying like, I hear you, I hear what you're saying. Some people might draw on use red marker to draw on their hands instead of cutting their skin. Or if the voice says, throw yourself out a window, go down to the stoop and throw yourself off a little stair where you can't be hurt. So I told this voice, you're right, but first I have to read this book, which I was never going to read that book. I'm sorry, like too many elves and orcs for me. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember that voices often speak in metaphor. So a voice telling me that I need to die does not necessarily mean that my heart has to stop beating, right? At that time in my life, there were a lot of things that needed to end. I was using drugs again. My job was really hard. They treated me very poorly at my job because I was someone with psychiatric diagnosis, and I had to end. I was in a relationship that wasn't good. There were so many things that needed to end in my life so that I could go on living. And yeah, I think this is one of the most powerful lessons I've learned about voices. They don't always speak. in a very direct way. Sometimes it's a metaphor. And that brings me to spiritual voices. One of my great lessons, one of my great teachers with tub voices is our ancestor, Abraham. So Abraham hears a voice telling him to make elevation offering of his son. And so he hears that and he's like, okay, so I need to get wood and a knife and I need to go up the mountain and I need to kill my son. He thought elevation offering meant a very literal thing. But when I looked, in the Torah there, what happens? God comes back and is like, no, not like that, not like that. And tells him not to do this. Don't actually take a life because you've heard my voice. Instead, think of a deeper meaning for what this could be. Maybe your son can be the next part of this lineage of people, of Hebrew people. So this idea that voices are metaphorical has saved my life, and I know it's saved other people's lives throughout the centuries. So eventually, when I was 30, I had done a lot of healing. I'd lived for a while on a therapeutic farm, a farm where instead of being locked in a hospital, we took care of sheep, and I learned to take care of someone else. And these sheep and donkeys were my first relationships of healing. I was very afraid of people by the time I was 25. But I began to heal. And also for me, my story involves taking less drugs. So I stopped taking many drugs, prescribed drugs. I don't take dopamine blocking drugs, what are called antipsychotics. I don't use opiates or heroin anymore. That was another heavy drug that I used. And so I stopped taking many drugs, and I reached out to, in 12-step, when you're trying to stop taking drugs, you ask God for help. And so what happened to me was I was saying this prayer to ask God for help, and I started to hear a lot more voices. And it was very vague, and it was very extreme, and I fell on the ground. And I didn't know what to do because I had been an atheist. And so now I'm hearing this voice, these voices that say that they're holy. And so, yeah, I kind of had to choose. Do I want to be an atheist who's like a schizophrenic? Or do I want to believe that there's something bigger than I know out there? And so I made this choice because the voices I'd heard were incredibly loving and helpful. Though what I will say is this: these types of voices, again, I don't always want to take them literally. So I remember one Rosh Hashanah, one of my voices, who I call Shekinah, she sounds like a grandmother. She sounds like an older, actually African-American woman. She told me, "Child, go pick up that scroll. Go pick it up. Go. Go, child, pick it up and run with it. Run with it, child, right into the woods. Take off your shoes and run into the woods, child. Go. And I was kind of like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. I'm sure many of us have been to Rosh Hashanah, Torah service. Probably not a good idea to take a scroll worth hundreds of thousands of shekels and just grab it and run into the woods. So I had to figure out, with the help of other people, how do I understand spiritual voices like this? How do I live with these? And so for me, my understanding is not to actually do that, but to think about, how do I make teachings my own? How do I make my environment sacred at all times? How do I honor that the woods are sacred and remember to metaphorically remove my shoes, because places can be holy. Though I'll be honest, I still like taking my shoes off in a lot of different places. So there's a lot of ways. I know these are very common. They can be difficult. And yeah, so I support a lot of different people. I live in the United States, many different traditions. For me, when things become very overwhelming, though, I have words that always work for me. So I can say, ורחמים, חסד ושלום. And this will always work. We just have to keep doing it. For me, this works. But I have to keep doing it like that over and over. And then it helps me bring all these voices together and find the point. So unfortunately, I'm running out of time. I have to speak much slower here for Renana. So I wanted to have time for questions. I'm going to be here for a while, but I want to give space for the break. I've learned Israelis really like breaks. You need many more breaks than Americans do. So my voice has led me here. I heard a voice, a holy voice. It said to me, move to Massachusetts, do what is asked of you. And I thought, I had to think about it. Is this literal? But it felt very literal. And I went to Massachusetts and I applied for a job that I wanted, and I didn't get the job. And I was like, I turned to my voice and I said, becoming one, why you told me to move to Massachusetts, but I didn't get the job. And the voice just said again, move to Massachusetts, do what is asked of you. And so what I learned is I had been trying to get the job I wanted, but it wasn't what people needed from me. And what was asked of me was to do this Hearing Voices network work, to create communities where there is less fear. And so that is another thing that led me here. So I want to say that my voices have led me here. And what I'll say in closing, there was an article recently in the New York Times where Pesach and me were in this article, and it had a very strange headline. It said, doctors gave her antipsychotics. She decided to live with her voices. And I thought that was strange that I used all these different strategies, but what's most interesting is that I don't take antipsychotics. Like, why is that so shocking? There's so many other things I do. And I use a sleep medication to sleep. Sleeping, very important for all of this, to sleep. But for me, like my story is that I was a person that used to live in a near constant total state of fear. Constant fear. I was afraid of my voices. I was afraid of my parents. I was afraid of my teachers, psychiatrists. I was afraid to leave my house. I lived in constant fear, and people were afraid of me. And so for me, my story is really that I could go from a life of total and constant fear to this life where I have moments of community and peace. And that's what I want for all of us, whether you're a clinician, an experiencer like me, whatever your role, is that we can just live in less fear of each other, less fear of our emotions, less fear of our experiences. There's a poet I like named Hafez. He's a Sufi, and he says, fear is the cheapest room in the house. Fear is the cheapest room in the house. I want to see you living in better conditions. So I leave you with that. Oh, also another great line I love from the very end of Shabbat. In America, we say, Adonai mich v'lo hira. And that's how we end it. So less fear. Thanks everybody for listening.